Since it is my 1 year anniversary with the Amex Gold Card, I wanted to come on here and tell you guys about the trips that I've taken in 1 year of having the card and how much they cost. And then I'm going to tell you if I still think travel cards are worth it. So I got my Gold Card last November and I took my first out-of-state trip in May. Well, it was end of April, like April 29th into May 1st. At this point, I had already received my 100,000 point welcome offer in March, and then I also received a few points from referrals. One of my New Year's resolutions, and we keep our New Year's resolutions around here, okay, was to take my first solo trip. And so I decided to take my first solo trip to Fort Lauderdale because it's somewhere that I go frequently multiple times a year since I was like 5 or 6, so that's where I felt the safest to go by myself. So originally that flight cost me 8,500 miles one way, but then I decided that I wanted to fly first class for the second time, so I canceled that one-way ticket and then I rebooked using my Delta SkyMiles card, because with my Delta SkyMiles card I also get $100 credit to use at Delta when I spend $10,000 or more in a single calendar year. First class ticket was about $350, and then after the $100, $250 for one way. I was only in Fort Lauderdale for 2 nights, and I just did things that I wanted to do, like go to Candlelands, eat at Crafty Crab. There's nothing better in the world than a seafood boil and a pina colada. I also went to Flamingo Gardens and had my very first spa experience. Then I stopped by my grandparents' house for a couple hours before my flight, and I watched Cocaine Bear, and I have no comment about that film. It was a really great trip. My flight back home was 8,200 JetBlue points, but since they don't have a 1-to-1 ratio, it ended up being around 10,000 Amex points, which is still really good. And I'm so sorry, I do not remember the exact cash price, but for 8,200 miles, just based on other flights that I've booked and I've seen, I think the cash price would have been around $150, give or take. And then I had to pay $5.60 to book the flight, and then around $6 to transfer the points from Amex to JetBlue. So while these flights are not completely free, I would say $11.20 for a one-way flight is a pretty good deal. The next trip I booked using points was to Fort Lauderdale again, but this time it was in June, so about a month later, and it was for our family trip. And I actually didn't even use the points for my own flight. I bought my brother and sister a round-trip flight, and so it was 39,200 points for the both of them. So not 39,200 points each, 39,200 points round trip for both of their flights. I do know the exact cash price for those tickets. It was $332 round trip. The cent per point on these trips weren't anything crazy. They were definitely both under 2 cents per point. But again, it was 39,200 JetBlue points. And so because I had to transfer my points and they do not have a 1-to-1 ratio with Amex, they are actually having a promo right now as we speak, I believe. Where it's a 1-to-1 ratio or 250 to 250. So if you are looking to transfer some JetBlue points for a flight you have coming up, I would definitely recommend you doing that as soon as possible. But it cost me just under 50,000 Amex points to book these flights. And then I paid about $30 in taxes to transfer the 50,000 points over to JetBlue. So that total comes to $52.40 for 2 round-trip flights, which I think is, again, a really good deal. Now, this next trip that I booked was supposed to be a solo trip again. It was a trip to Vegas, and I booked my flight on Delta during a Delta flash sale, which they had in July. I have not since seen another Delta flash sale, so I'm wondering if that's something they only do in July or if that's something they do sporadically throughout the year. I was able to get a one-way flight to Vegas on Delta for 10,000 miles, which was amazing. And then for the return flight, the only flight they had that was also 10,000 miles had a layover, and I don't do layovers, so I ended up booking my flight coming back home on JetBlue, and that was 10,000 miles as well. So I booked the trip first and then told my mom about it, and she's like, "Oh, I have a $500 Delta credit." So I'm like, "Oh, well, I guess you can come on my trip." So I ended up inviting her on the trip with me. And then a week before the actual trip, my brother and sister are begging me to come on the trip as well. They claim that the only place we go as a family is Fort Lauderdale, and they really wanted to go to Encore too, because that's kind of something that I introduced the whole family to and something that we kind of do together. So I agreed to bring them, and this is the part of the story that just makes me sick to my stomach. The night that I was talking to my brother about bringing him, I checked the flight prices. It was still only 12,000 miles, which wasn't bad. It's obviously more expensive than what I paid, but 12,000 miles one way wasn't terrible. Then the next day, the flight price jumps to 22,000 miles just for one way. My mom was buying their tickets back home in cash on JetBlue, so that wasn't part of this whole equation. I just agreed to fly them there using points. And then with all the back and forth deciding whether or not they should come for reasons that didn't have to do with the flight jumped up again to 39,500 points for one way, for one of them. And there's 2 of them. So the choice was to either pay $1,000 for one way or 70,000 miles. And I wasn't paying $1,000 for them to come to Vegas. These are not even my kids. And yes, while it's not always about the best redemption, paying 70,000 miles for them for one way to go to Vegas. Like, I could see if we were going to Japan, that would be an amazing deal. But to go to Vegas, when I myself only paid 10,000 miles, that's just what makes me like. I didn't speak to my family for 2 days after I booked these flights. I texted my mom. I said, hey, I got the flights. I would prefer if nobody spoke to me because I was just so upset. But I still have plenty of points to go wherever I want in the world. So I try not to let it bother me. It's just one of those things I try not to think about, because when I think about it, it makes me upset. The next trip I took was actually literally 24 hours after I got back from Vegas, and it was a solo trip again to Paris. I booked my flight during KLM's 25% promotion, which they have about twice per year. The cash tickets were over $2,200, and I only paid 28,000 points round trip, so that's about 8 cents per point. I could have gone to Paris twice and booked an additional one-way ticket for the same amount of points it cost me to bring my brother and sister one way to Vegas, just to put that in perspective. Paris again was another solo trip, like I said, and it was poorly planned on my part because planning that Vegas trip really stressed me out. But I did get to do a lot of cool things, like have lunch inside the Eiffel Tower. I was there eating for like 3 hours, and then I was walking around the Eiffel Tower for another hour and a half. It was like really such a fun experience. And that was also my first time eating at a Michelin star restaurant, so that was a really good time. I tried caviar for the first time and just had all these different foods that I didn't even know existed. I also ate at the Dior restaurant, which was really good. I did really want to go horseback riding at Versailles, but that didn't work out. But definitely going to be going back, and when I do, that will be something that I do. And then for this next trip, my aunt was telling me about how she's planning a family trip, and I decided to invite myself because anytime someone tells me they're going somewhere, I want to go too. And that trip is actually a week from today, so I'm really excited about it, but I'm not going to tell you guys where I'm going. If the world was a safer place, I would tell you guys, but since it's not, this trip was a little tricky. So like I said, it's not always about, the best redemption. Sometimes it's just about using points and not having to use cash. The cash ticket was so low. It was like $153. So I'm like, do I want to use my points for this, or do I want to pay cash? I wasn't really sure, so I just decided to use points for one way and then pay cash coming back. So the flight there was 9,800 points and then $5.60 in taxes. And then again, the flight coming home, I paid in cash $153. The year still isn't over, and I would not be surprised if I found time to squeeze in one more trip in December, even though I'm already taking a trip in December. I paid cash for that trip, so I'm not going to mention it because it's irrelevant. I did not have the best redemptions this year. I actually had a couple really bad ones, but I will say some of the trips that I took this year absolutely would not have happened if it were not for points, like the trip to Paris. $2,200 just for a flight is crazy. An economy at that. I still would have went to Vegas, just my brother and sister probably wouldn't have been able to come without points. So I've had a great year with points, but does that mean that points and travel credit cards and travel charge cards are something that you should have? I will say it depends on your schedule. I have the flexibility to book flights when they are the cheapest. Same thing with hotels. The whole reason I went to Vegas when I did is because I went on Encore's website and I saw that on September 4th, the rates at Encore were like $150, the lowest that they probably have been all year. So I'm like, okay, this is when I'm going to Vegas. I didn't go to Vegas on September 4th because that's when I was free, or that's when my job would let me go. I went to Vegas solely because that's when it was the cheapest to go. So for something like that, I think it works out really well. If you have a job or you have a schedule or you have some restrictions that only let you travel on certain dates or on the weekends, I think whether or not travel credit cards are worth it becomes a little bit more tricky because you're going to be paying significantly more for flights. For example, the flight to Paris that cost me 28,000 miles because I was able to book on the cheapest available day, you might pay 70,000 miles for that same flight if you had to then travel 4 days later than me on the weekend. And depending on how much you spend, if you only earn 45,000 to 50,000 points a year and you're having to spend 60,000 points on one flight because you can only travel on the weekends when it's most expensive, it just might not be worth it for you, especially if the card you are earning points on has an annual fee. I think travel credit cards work the best for people who are the most flexible. And if you are not flexible, I think you should be spending enough to earn enough points that will sustain you, because you're going to have no choice but to book those flights that are more expensive because that's what your schedule allows. So that's when switching to cash back becomes a conversation. Or some people do spend 10 years accumulating points and then they decide to spend a month or two traveling the world. So I'm not saying that's a good idea or something that you should do, but it is something that people do. And if that's something that you want to consider, then that's completely on you. My first year with the Amex Gold Card has been nothing but amazing. When I applied last November, I had no idea I would end up in Paris or have the ability to go to Paris or London or Greece multiple times. So it's just been nothing but a great experience. But I do think I might switch to the green card. So stay tuned for that. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.